this is now the 10th hour that we've been on air doing this. Had some amazing guests, but we have two more amazing guests on this hour. We've got Farah. We're very, very fortunate to have Farah Pandith here, former special representative to Muslim communities. She'll be in conversation with Jasmine El-Gamal from the Atlantic Council. I just got to say, Farah has been, in particular, someone I've known for going on 15 years now, and has been an amazing inspiration to me and supportive of just about everything I'm doing right now. She really knows what she's talking about. Her latest book is How We Win. It was published just last year. An amazing overview from her days in government under the Bush and Obama administrations on how we win the battle against extremists. I highly recommend that book. Yeah, so I want to just turn it over to you guys. We've got an hour, but obviously, one of the subject of this is how governments deal with crises. And I know that, this is something, Farah, you and I have spoken about in particular in the past. But we're now dealing with the mother of all crises, both on the local, national, international level, and we're seeing now evidence of how different strategies and different governments are affecting how we survive all of this. So I'll just turn it over to you two, actually, if both of you could say a little bit about yourself. I mean, I just gave the brief introduction, but please both introduce yourself, and then let's have the discussion.
Well, first of all, I just want to say I hope that everybody is doing well, and I hope that everybody is safe and healthy and their families are well. This is a very taxing period for all of us. So I appreciate you taking time today to have a conversation with us. Secondly, Zahid, honestly, it is a pleasure and a privilege to actually be able to talk to you on this kind of forum. I think about the conversations we had nearly 20 years ago around how to engage with Muslims in new ways, how to make sure that we're front and center doing different kinds of things and not put into boxes and pigeonholes. And so I really appreciate having a chance to talk to you and talk to my friends. I see a lot of names that I know, and I want to thank you. You gave a lovely overview of who I am. I just want to give you a couple of personal notes, if that's all right, just so that we are all friends and you all know a little bit more about me. It is true that I served in government in both the Bush and Obama administrations, but I think more than that, it's most important, I think, for you to know that I was born in northern India and came to America when I was a baby and grew up outside of Boston. And I say that because my journey, learning about who I was and being an American and being a Muslim, was all around the way I was raised in the United States. And public service was very important for my family. So I feel extremely privileged to have been able to serve, but I also feel very lucky to have been able to be brought up by a mom who was very knowledgeable about Islam and about how to be the best person you can be in a community. So that's the part that I just want to tell you. That's who I am, and thank you for having me today.
And Jasmine, we've not met, but please introduce yourself.
Right. Well, I feel like I know you already because Twitter just makes me feel like I know so many people that I've never met before. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for asking me to interview Farah, who I've already said on Twitter that I have just long admired. And Farah, nice to see you. So a little bit about my background. So like Farah, I grew up outside the US. I was born in the US, but I was raised in Egypt by Egyptian parents, immigrants to the US who made a pretty difficult decision to take us from the US when we were young kids back to Egypt so that we could grow up in Egypt, learn the language, learn the culture. They had a very strong idea about how important it was to know where you were from, like know your roots, and then you can go out and do whatever you want. And although we didn't really understand it at the time, I'm eternally grateful always for that decision. So I think Farah and I have a lot in common in that sense, but also like Farah, I'm a Muslim American woman and worked at the Pentagon for 8 years, worked on crisis account after crisis account, the Arab Spring, Syria, Iraq, ISIS, all this stuff. And time time again, I was reminded of how important it was to learn how to relate across cultures and sort of think about the issues in a very human way, and not just in a, whether it's defense or diplomacy or, you know, any of the ways that you would think we were trained to think about these problems, but just to bring the concepts and the values that we were raised with, which is just talking and thinking about people as human beings first and as labels afterwards, and bringing that into our work as American policymakers. So Farah was kind of the vanguard for us as Muslim Americans in terms of what she was doing, working with Muslim American or with Muslim communities across the world. But it was something that I try to do as well, and something that I try to pass on to younger generations, as does Farah. So I'm really pleased to be here, really pleased to be interviewing Farah and talking to her about what is probably one of the biggest crises that I think that we are facing in our lifetimes. So if we can, you know, if we can just turn to that. Farah, I know that you were at the cutting edge of government response when it came to post 9/11, even the very, very beginning of what we later came to call the war on terror, and the responses, and not just trying to react to crises, but also trying to be forward-leaning, right? And trying to be proactive and preventing further crises and snowballing of the crises that were happening at the time. So bringing that into account, bringing that sort of experience into account, given this crisis that we're facing now, which so many presidents and world leaders have called a faceless enemy, a nameless enemy. They've said we were at war. They have said we are at war with this enemy. It's not an army, but it's an enemy nonetheless. How do you feel about that? I mean, how do you look at that in terms of what you've been through and how you faced previous crises before that were much more tangible than the one now? If you can just give us a little bit of your personal take, and then we can go into the question of why governments have been so unprepared for something like this.
Well, I think it's an important question to ask, sort of where are we and what is the enemy that we're facing? And, you know, one of the biggest lessons in preparation for today, I was just really thinking about leadership. And I was really thinking about crisis and leadership. I was thinking about preparedness. I was thinking about both the short term and the longer term all being done simultaneously. Obviously, the first part of any crisis is containment, containing the threat, trying to make sure that we understand what we can be doing right now. But simultaneously, you have to be thinking, obviously, about what the medium and the long-term implications are and how to make sure that you are containing those threats as well. So when I think about terminology, you very smartly said, you know, different leaders around the world are calling it different things. I'll put on my IR hat and say to you, I mean, one could have a conversation about what we call this. I mean, is this World War III? There are many reasons why one would imagine that we are executing a war. We are using a different type of weaponry, but we're going after it. And we know what the enemy is. It may be faceless. I mean, you can't see the virus, but we know what it is. It's not an unknown. And I don't want to make too stark a parallel between an ideology and a virus. There are conversations that we can have about the war on terror and how we think about soft power and ideology, and we can go there if you want, Jasmine. But one of the things that I think is important is the failure of leadership at this moment in time with the greatest crisis we have faced as a planet. It has gone into every pore of our beings. The failure to actually see the thing that we're dealing with and to rally the kind of response that is needed. So when I look at where we are, this is not just an American speaking, it's really sort of the larger picture. We have not seen a cohesive action that has come forward to build the kind of responses that we need on the short term, the immediate term, like containing the threat, and then also thinking in a forward-leaning posture, how do you make sure that we are ready for what we obviously know are going to be months and months and months ahead of various results of what we've just seen. And so for me, I look at this crisis and I think it is a formidable enemy for sure. But what happens when you have an enemy that also doesn't have anybody on offense who is going after it? And I want to say that to me is where my mind is as I think about policymakers, doing the work that they should have been doing to prepare ourselves for what we're dealing with right now.
So you just said something that I think kind of strikes at the heart of government responses around the world to this. And it's a fascinating exercise to look at the way autocratic governments have dealt with this versus democratic governments. And you've mentioned the short term versus the long term. I saw this time and time again in my time in government, as have you, right? What is the impact of a government that is democratic, that has to think about elections every 4 years, that has to think about very short-term, quick wins at the expense of longer-term initiatives? How do you think that is playing out in this whole crisis? I mean, if you're looking at the way that democratic governments are dealing with this, the US, France, Italy, Spain, versus countries like China. I mean, if you look at what Hungary has been doing, basically taking advantage of the crisis, is this a wake-up call in terms of showing the world what are the advantages and disadvantages of democratic versus autocratic governance and governments?
If we only had the time to be so filled with luxury that we could give lessons to the rest of the world about how to behave, I think our actions could have proven the lessons that we wanted. And I think one of the things that I look at is, the intellectual gurus who are running around talking about what we ought to be doing in terms of showing the world. I would like us to show the world by doing what it is we know how to do. We can mobilize a crisis response. We did it after 9/11. We understood that we had to share intel, we had to do all kinds of things. It's not a perfect parallel, but there was American leadership, there was British leadership, there was European leadership, and how we thought about the threat that we're facing. And I look at every country is for themselves right now. We couldn't even get the G20 to figure out how to issue a statement because the United States of America could not be bold enough to think more creatively as opposed to being partisan. We were insisting on adding a dimension to the conversation that was all around targeting China. That's different, okay? Right now, what we ought to be seeing is a cohesive global strategy of every kind of leader, whether they were democratically elected or not, to be able to say, because this virus is spreading the way it is, and because we understand how it is transmitted, there are things that need to happen on the commercial side, on the transportation side, on the medical side that we can work on together. This isn't enough for just the WHO to sort of give press conferences. This requires leadership and determination and focus by many countries who are breaking this down and understanding what they can do. So one of the things that I will say is that, when you said, is this an opportunity for us to tell the rest of the world how great America is? Let me show you our democracy and what we can do. America has failed in its most basic formula here. We did not see the kind of leadership, and this isn't meant to be a dismissal of the Trump administration. It is to shine a sharp light on what can happen well and go in a forward direction, or what happens when it's not. And across the board, this administration has in fact fallen down on all the very basic things. When I think about lessons to learn, one of the most important things, I had conversations this past week with people who were working on the bird flu in the Bush administration and on MERS and SARS in the Obama administration, and understanding that you have to have the humility to understand what came before you and to know that there are plans that may not be perfect plans, but preparedness plans that you can work together on. And you should have that kind of humility to be able to go back to former administrations and say, what can I learn from the conversations that you had and how you guys prepared? What are we not seeing? How do we execute everything at our fingertips? How do we think about things? And leadership is required for that at every turn. So I don't see that happening. I don't want to sit here and criticize other governments, because we have a diverse group of Europeans and others who are on this call, and they can speak better to the issues of what's happened within their country. But I can certainly say, as an American, and also as a former policymaker, both somebody who saw this at the NSC and at the State Department, and by the way, at USAID, things can happen simultaneously with whole of government if, in fact, and only if, you have the kind of leadership that comes from the White House that puts the program in place. And if you don't have that leadership, you see the vacuum that we're facing today.
Absolutely. And you said two words that I think are just so key to this conversation: leadership and continuity. Two incredibly important concepts when it comes to dealing with any sort of crisis. So I remember, I don't know if you remember this, but I remember about 4 years ago now, I was researching US government responses to countering violent extremism. And I interviewed you for the project because you had worked for the Bush administration, under the Obama administration. And I think it was at the tail end of the Obama administration when I was interviewing about this. And I started asking you all these questions about the Obama administration's response to CVE, as we had started calling it at the time. And you said, Jasmine, CVE didn't start with the Obama administration. We were doing CVE in the Bush administration. We were countering violent extremism in the Bush administration. There were people who came in who may not have taken the necessary time to look at what previous administrations were doing. Not a criticism of any one person or any one party or anything like that, but again, just what you said about the importance of continuity. And I think that we see this again, which I think you found a bit lacking, if I might, I don't want to speak for you, but in the Obama administration when it came to CVE. But if we look at what the Trump administration has done in terms of policy, again, kind of looking at the Obama administration's policies and saying, no, we have our own policies. This is a new page. We're going to do everything from scratch. And when you have an administration that comes in every 4 years or 8 years and is intent on doing things their own way and just kind of ignoring what previous administrations have done, at the expense of the American people, or in the case of the US, at the expense of the world potentially, because the US is a world leader and what the US does matters to the rest of the world. So continuity, I think, is really important. It's a really important point that you brought up, but also leadership. I mean, I've seen time and time again over the last few months articles written about how incredibly important leadership is at a time of crisis. And that could be a whole other conversation about the different leadership styles, whether leaders are choosing to do this by speaking to the people or galvanizing government or whatever. But to talk about the corona crisis right now, COVID-19, I read an article just today or yesterday. I think it was a Washington Post article, but basically they were talking about how different governors and mayors are just sort of having to fend for themselves and trying to come up with a plan, not just to address not just to flatten the curve, but to get ahead of the curve and try to be more proactive rather than just reactive, but running into problems time and time again because they're just not getting the proper leadership and support at the national level. So, and also the same article was talking about an initiative that Google and Apple are doing together to try to help trace the crisis from people who've had it to people who might have, been involved or close to people had it. So in your book, How We Win, you talked about the importance of kind of a whole of society approach, right? You talked about governments can't do this alone. The private sector can't do this alone. Tech companies can't do this alone. We are all in this together. How do you feel about this? I mean, do you feel the same way about the response to pandemics in terms of the need for tech and private sector and public sector to come together? If that's the case, who is the leader? And if that's the case, is it the traditional leader that we have always known, which is the president, or do other leaders come along, like governors or mayors? I mean, how do you pull apart all of that?
Well, I think you're raising a series of really important questions around leadership. And one of the most important things, we have to look back at history and look at moments when leaders have pulled together, whether it's World War I or World War II, whether it was something like 9/11 or 7/7. You know, we have seen people rise up and step into the moment where they're doing three things. One is they're speaking to their citizens, and they are setting the tone, and they're framing the issue, and they're doing it in a way so that their constituents, if you will, can understand the crisis moment that they're in. You know, the second is they're also speaking to, you know, the adversary. And they're saying to the adversary, in this case, obviously with COVID, we can't speak to the virus, but you're also saying, you know, here I'm signaling to you how serious we're taking it, which is why you sit at the Resolute desk and you make the statement that you're going to make, whether you're going to, you know, whatever you're going to do. But the third constituency, as the leader thinks about the crisis, is obviously the fellow people within his or her government. And that is really important because it says and signals that they are taking it seriously and that they have a plan, that there's a way forward, that they're thinking about how to utilize it. So when I think about the COVID response, certainly in many countries in Europe, and also certainly in the United States, we haven't seen the kind of, oh, so somebody has their phone on. I would strongly suggest that we turn off, yeah, there, good to hear the feedback. We haven't seen that kind of deep concentration on those three aspects of what needs to happen. So that's just one point I would say. The second is I call for something in my book that can be absolutely pivotal to how we think about the COVID situation. Everybody here on the call knows what hard power is, and everybody knows what soft power is. And I have been thinking, when I was in government, I was thinking a lot about soft power because that's the work that I was doing in terms of fighting the ideology of extremist groups. That's soft power. But one of the things I realized is that government did not, soft power wasn't giving us everything that we knew that we had in our arsenal. And so I talk about a derivative of soft power called open power. And it's exactly as you would hear it. Opening up the aperture to solutions, opening up the way you think about an issue, a crisis, and figuring out how to bring as many different kinds of voices to solution sets as possible. Government silos, government goes in, government narrows, it doesn't go broad. And so when you think about something like extremism, or you are fighting, you know, fighting the groups that want to radicalize young people, whether they're neo-Nazis or they're the so-called Islamic State, you want as many solutions available as you can. And that is true for COVID also. What we have to be thinking about is how to open up the aperture and to bring as many skill sets and ideas to the table as possible. And that's where it connects with your second point about business playing a part here. And so what you've seen is with the whole of leadership, whole as in H-O-L-E, the vacancy of leadership in the United States, of course, governors and mayors have said, what can I do? That's leadership. That's saying, if I'm not seeing the crisis plan from that place, I've got to figure out the crisis plan in a new way. And how do I think about all the things that I need, whether it is PPE, whether it is thinking about how the kids in the schools are going to learn how to, you know, do distance learning, whether it's making sure that the supply chain is working, you know, whatever the components of the threat is for that town or that state, you're seeing local governors and mayors in the United States coming forward to do more because there has been an absence of a plan. There's no cohesive you know, system that is in place, certainly all these weeks afterwards, to get us going. And so that's why you've seen this ad hoc, really unfortunate response to this crisis that we're dealing with. But I think that there's something extremely important, and that's the third part of what you said. Yes, government has, I think, in COVID, the most important role to play in terms of setting the tone and getting the plan in place. Business has innovation. It has a new way of thinking about this. You know, you're seeing invention happen in real time on the internet with people going, wait, you needed this? How about trying that? Or can I adapt the thing that I've been working on for that to make you be able to fix this, whether it's a ventilator serving 2 people or it's a different kind of mask or whatever it is. You're seeing that kind of invention happening. But there's a third and really important component. It isn't just the public sector. It's not just the private sector. It's regular citizens and it's philanthropy. And those sectors are critical to how we think about these kinds of crises. It's critical in my book with fighting extremism, but it's also, obviously, as we're all sitting isolated at home because we know the part that we can play, one human, making sure that we're doing what we can do to make sure that health workers are not having to deal with one more case in the hospital. That's what we're doing sitting at home today. So what's the role that we can be playing? And importantly, I would argue too, this kind of thing that we're doing, what has happened in the last few weeks with regular citizens talking to each other saying, wait a minute, this thing that we're dealing with is going to be over a much longer period of time than we thought. This is going to impact the way we think about a whole host of things. What I've seen is in this crisis, there will be opportunity, obviously. There were new things that will be born, and many of the things that may be born come from the kinds of conversations that we have with our peers. I hope, and this is the final point I'll make about what you said, I really hope, and this is where, you know, you look back at other crises and you say, well, where did the world get that money to be able to do the research for HIV/AIDS, for example? When it came to the fore in the 1980s. It was because we didn't only wait for government to deal with HIV/AIDS. We had every single part of society saying, we're scared, there's something we can do, there's money we can put into research, there's education in terms of teaching people about safe sex, there's stuff that we can be doing. So it was all of society and activists who were working really hard to put this on the table. So whether it is HIV/AIDS, whether it is the environment, which is, by the way, a crisis that is very common. I mean, it's a nice parallel to, unfortunately, to the hell we're going through right now. But what I want to see is not just leadership, but I want to see the formulation of the movements of regular people that are pressing upon their elected leaders, that are pressing upon business and innovation, and are pressing upon their fellow citizens to take charge and do far more. Because if we sit back and wait for somebody else to do it, it will not get done.
You know, I'm sitting here listening to you, and I love the emphasis that you put on people, on just individuals and human beings. You bring it back to the person, because at the end of the day, whether it's government or private sector or even philanthropy, I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's all about the individual. I mean, government is made up of a series of individuals, right? I mean, if I had a nickel for every time someone in the Middle East, for example, and they were talking to me about Syria or Egypt, and they said, well, the US government can just do this.
Yeah.
And I would try to explain that the US government is actually not this thing. It's actually just a bunch of people working as hard as they can with limited bandwidth and limited resources, and trying to do the best that they can. But it all comes back to people, and all comes down to people. So I wanted to turn you to an issue that I haven't read much about, and I'd be curious to hear what you think about this, especially from your time working on crisis responses in government. And that's the emotional aspect of all of this, right? I mean, I read an article the other day by Stephen Kessler. I think that was his name. So he's an expert on grief, and he worked on sort of, you know, the 5 stages of grief that we all know about. So he actually
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's.
Exactly. So she wrote the book on the 5 stages of dying, and then the 5 stages of grief, and he worked very closely with her. for years. And then after her death, he actually wrote a book with the permission of her family and her estate to add a sixth element to that, which is meaning, finding meaning. And so he wrote an article recently about the COVID crisis and how we're all dealing with it. And the article was titled, "What You're Feeling Right Now is Grief." And he was talking about the fact that we are collectively mourning a loss of normalcy, even if we can't identify it, right? We don't know what we feel. We just know that we're anxious and troubled and snappy and grumpy and tired and all of that stuff. But he tried to identify it for us. He said, what you're feeling is a loss of normalcy. You're mourning the loss of a certainty of the future. You're mourning the loss of plans that you've made. I mean, it's all sorts of mourning. And if you think about the way that we are mourning or dealing emotionally as individuals to this crisis, do you think, and this is not a leading question because I don't know the answer to this question, is that something, speaking of preparedness, that the government, at least, you know, whether it's in the US or the WHO, global governance institutions, should they be taking things like that into account? Emotion, anxiety, just what people are feeling? Is that something that the government should be paying attention to just as much as tangible kind of responses like ventilators and masks and hospital beds?
Well, I think it's a really important question to ask, but I want to take a step back, and I want to say to you that we've only been doing this for a few weeks, and it is a very privileged thing for us to be talking about how difficult it is not to be able to go outside and to hang out with your friends and to do it. And many of the people on this call, including you, including me, have been to parts of the world where people go through this kind of thing in a much more aggressive way. And so I want to be very careful when I talk about what we are going through. We, the Westerners here on this Zoom call, as we are privileged to sit in a warm environment with food in our bellies, not worried about anything that could be happening to us from the security point of view. So that's just, you know, our mental state is very different from others who are dealing with COVID in places in the world where, on top of everything else, in terms of the fear of getting the virus, you're also dealing with all of the other hell that they deal with every single day. So that's one thing I want to just put on the table immediately. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I think mental health has been consistently dismissed by governments all over the world in many different ways. So it would be shocking and surprising if suddenly today, with something like COVID, you see the kind of response from governments that say, we're going to take mental health seriously and we're going to put this front and forward in any kind of comprehensive way. If I had a magic wand and I could think about what I'd want to see happen, I would want us to have the kind of hotlines and virtual connections for people who need to speak to people who are in grief, who are worried, who are dealing with anxiety and, you know, all of the other things. And grief is a part of all of this. It's grief for humanity. It's grief for the unknown. It's fear, you know, for what comes. It's all of these things that are combined. But you know, one of the things that I this afternoon, I listened to Boris Johnson's comments, and I thought to myself, you know, well, I'm surprised. Here you see a man who did not have that same tone prior to getting sick, look directly into a camera and speak to the citizens of the UK with emotion, with honesty, with a sense of empathy, with a sense of compassion, and I thought it was wild. I was like, wow, look at that. And I was very happy to see it. We have not seen in the United States. I also heard, I want to be fair, I heard there have been other world leaders who have done that beautifully. in New Zealand, in France, and other parts of the world where their leaders are talking to the population from the heart. They're saying the things that you want the leaders to hear. We have not gotten that privilege in the United States. We have not seen that kind of human element that shows us that that there's empathy and compassion involved in what we're dealing with as a nation. I think more than anything, frankly, this is not just about, will we be able to go back to grocery stores, tomorrow, and can we shake hands again, and what did Dr. Fauci say? And I mean, it's far more than that. It is, for me, I think, in talking to, and again, a very privileged set of people that I get to talk to, but it is deep despair about what we had not done, what we are still not doing, and what it means for humanity in general. And I think, we're going to have waves upon waves of people from every ethnic background, every class background, having to handle all of this deep, weight of the world on us, not just now, but in the months and perhaps years afterwards. And we're not set up to be able to do that. So would I like to see governments put money where their mouth is around mental health? Yes. Would I like to see philanthropists figure out a way to perhaps give some sort of inspiration and connectivity to those people who are trying to find meaning? And that's the final point I'll make. The way you said it in terms of finding meaning, let me just turn that on its head so it's not all doom and gloom. This could be a reflection point for a lot of us. And it could be a reflection point in which we do understand and do ask the question, what's important? And, what do we want to do with our lives? How do we want to work with our neighbors? How do we want to think about family? What are the things that are important? I think that this is an opportunity for us to reboot. And here we are on the eve of Ramadan, a few days away, where we are supposed to be doing that kind of reflection anyway. But will this bring us together? Will this ask us to do more? And I so hope that out of this hell, out of this crisis that we are facing, we aren't just waiting for the noble leader to tell us everything, but we are becoming leaders ourselves and doing it internally in our families and internally in ourselves and with each other as neighbors.
It's just such an important point that you're making about empathy, about taking a step back and thinking about what's important in life. I want to make one more point about that and then take it back to government response. I think what you mentioned about sort of the luxury, in a way, some of the questions that we in the West are dealing with about mental health seem like luxuries. You mentioned it yourself. I mean, some people in refugee camps don't have time to think about what's important in life and finding meaning and all of that stuff that I just asked you about. They're just thinking about surviving, as they have for the last however many years they've been refugees. So one thing that I found that this crisis has done, as do many crises, is shine a spotlight on the disparities between different groups of people. But at the same time, I found that it adds an element. So for example, like we're talking about someone in a refugee camp dealing with COVID, someone in the US dealing with COVID. One thing that the crisis does is shine a spotlight on how lucky people in the West are compared to someone in the refugee camp. But what that also does, and I'm not comparing, I'm just raising a point, it adds an element of, and this is just related to mental health, because I've been talking to some therapists about this, and they find that if you objectively know that you're in a position of privilege compared to other people in the world, and you're feeling depressed or tired or anxious or whatever, you also feel guilty about feeling that way because you think that you shouldn't, right? You think, oh, but I'm lucky. Why am I feeling, my feelings don't matter. And so there is also a bit of, and I think an importance in kind of acknowledging our feelings, even in a privileged position, and not minimizing them and saying, okay, it's okay to feel anxious, even though we have a roof over our heads and other people don't. Just sort of not to minimize that, address it, name it, deal with it, so that you can then become strong enough to help others who may not be as lucky as you. So that's just one reaction I had to what you were saying, because I think it's such an important point. But to go back to government responses, right? That the topic of our conversation, we've been seeing a tension in governments across the world between the need or the desire to really go full force, lock down, beat the COVID virus, and get people healthy and back to work. So just sort of shut everything down, protect the health of people and workers and everything. But that's in a tension with the obvious and natural need of a leader to protect the economy as well, and make sure that not just the day after, but between now and the day after, that entire economies don't just collapse as we're dealing with the crisis. And I don't know that anybody has found the right balance so far between maintaining the health of their populations, being proactive in dealing with the crisis, and protecting their economy at the same time. So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, how do you kind of assess what governments have been doing, what our own government has been doing, and whether they could have done, I mean, we can't really talk in hindsight yet fully because we're in it, but anything that you think we could have done better as governments?
Well, let me obviously, I'm not an economist, so I want to be very clear that I'm not going to give you economic insights that are going to move you. But I can speak certainly to rushing the system and just trying to get to the end and just trying to get whatever victory might be politically, driven. And there's deep danger in doing that. I mean, for me, I can bring it directly to the parallel around the kind of crisis I dealt with right after 9/11, and this idea for the quick win, the thing that you can like slap on the board and say, look what we did, we got that, we did this, done, we're all set, everything's fine. And it is over and over again, this is the kind of mistake that is a political mistake. It's not, there's a difference between a political decision and a policy decision. And the policy decisions have to be steady. They have to be clear. And I believe in this kind of crisis, the politicians who have to think about this have got to get a grip on what it is we're dealing with. This isn't something where if you just get through May, it's going to be fine, because you're not going to get the virus again, or you can't have a complete collapse again. What I'd like to see is for us to deploy everything the scientists and the medical community are telling us to go all in, to do everything they tell us to do, because they are actually the experts. The economists are not the experts. They can't drive the bus on when we go back to work. It is about a medical component to what's happening, because this virus is so aggressive and is so, obviously anybody can get it. That's why we're all isolating. So for me, I think understanding where expertise comes from, that's one of the big points that I forgot to make earlier. I think that there is a need in a crisis to use real experts, not people who think and say that they are. And we see this on TV daily, on the hour, people telling us what it is that they believe is the right thing, and they have no business saying what it is they need to say that they're saying. But here, it's literally life and death. And so what I'd like to say about sort of going back to work, or how you do things, nobody wants to have the economy suffer more than it already has, obviously. But more than anything, we've got to heal medically the communities so that it's safe for people to be able to go to work and to be at work, so we don't do this all over again. And from that perspective, let me just say, because I was not clear about it, if you don't value science as a country, if you do not value science and data, you find yourself in the situation that America is in today. Policymakers have not been driven by science. They've been driven by something completely different. And it is true that every other person in my family is a scientist of some sort or a medical doctor. So, and I'm not, okay? But, you know, this was in my brain from the time I was like a tiny human, you know, like where are the facts? Where's the analysis? Where's the rigor? And I listen and I watch Americans who are extremely well educated, but are not looking at the medical data, thinking that they can outsmart the doctors that are telling you what to do. And I find it amazing. If you are having chest pain, you're going to go to a specific kind of doctor, are you not? If they ask you for surgery and you need heart surgery, you're going to go to a thoracic surgeon. You're not going to go to a dermatologist. So what is it that what is happening to communities that they somehow are trying to outgame the game? I want to see us get back to a place where we are driven by facts, we are driven by science, we are driven by data, and then make the decision on if everything is safe and sound to go back to where we need to go. We'll open up life the way we knew it once before.
So that's actually a really interesting point that you bring up about who's an expert and who's not, and listening to medical professionals. And this is definitely a topic for another interview or another conversation, so I won't belabor the point, but just to bring up the fact that someone texted me earlier today and they said, we've noticed that you haven't been on Twitter in 3 days. And I said, yes, that is a very deliberate choice, because I am tired of everybody suddenly having a medical opinion about what's happening and going on Twitter and sharing articles that haven't been vetted, or even actual journalists and papers giving a headline and giving attention to every half-baked study that comes out that is based on nothing. And all of a sudden, you know, you're just overwhelmed with data. And if you go on Facebook, I mean, my mother, who may or may not be watching this right now, by the way, would tell me about some Lebanese doctor who was on Facebook, who was giving advice to people about this and that or the other. And if you're from a country like Egypt, for example, where many of my mother's friends are from, who get their news from Facebook, and you're listening to some bogus Lebanese doctor telling you to gargle with lemon water to beat the COVID crisis, you know what I'm talking about, right? So it's just, so of course it's not a topic of our conversation, but it's just like, it's a really important point that you made. It's about identifying the experts, being wise enough and careful enough to know who the experts are, and then giving the appropriate importance and weight to those experts who are. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna bring it back to leadership. Look, every leader in the world gets intel, and they get intel briefings, and I know how it's done in the United States government, and there's some form of that that's happening around the world, where you're gathering intelligence, you're letting the leader know what they're seeing, and you are making decisions in that period of time. That data has to be vetted. Certainly in our country, by the time it gets to the president, we're very sure of the things that we are saying to the president of the United States. And when you are dealing with a leader who doesn't take it seriously, and they believe that they know more than the experts who are providing you with the data, and that may be true of, we were talking about COVID today, it could have been, you know, pick your threat, a country threat of any kind, we have a problem. And that vacuum of information, and I don't want to just put it on the executive branch, I'll also give it to the legislative branch as well. We need to have a really deep reckoning in the United States around science, around data, and around leadership. Because I think one of the things that I've seen, certainly in the nonsense that's happening on WhatsApp and Facebook and Twitter and all these people sending every kind of thing forward for whatever reason they want to do. Let me just bring it back to the work that I do around fighting hate. These kinds of theories and conspiracies connect with me on a way when I start looking at this stuff. I'm like, my God, this is what ISIS did. This is what Al-Qaeda did. This is what the Taliban does. This is what the neo-Nazis do. They set up the system so that they push this crazy misinformation to the system, and it boggles the mind. How many people actually, oh, I agree with that. That makes sense. I know what that is. And so we're watching this in slow motion, but the risks today with this kind of nonsense are so scary because, you know, obviously it's scary for a kid to join a terrorist organization, but in this kind of crisis and this kind of thing, and I'll bring it all the way back. Here's where we can learn the value in facts and the value in taking seriously misinformation. And this is where I would love to have seen any kind of leader in the United States, around the world, anywhere, business sector, whatever, say, I see the parallels between the madness that's happening around fighting COVID and the skyrocketing numbers of people who hate and what that means. I'm actually going to go forward and we're going to do a lot more to work on that thing, because you know what? This isn't going to be contained to just hate or COVID. It is going to manifest in other crises that we're dealing with going forward. So one of the things that this hell has exposed is places where we need to repair and reboot and rebuild. And for me, that's where I want our focus to be. I can be deeply philosophical about what could have happened in America if only we had gotten the things together in January as opposed to late March. But I would rather today look at my friends who are up on this Zoom call and say, what are we going to do together to find and repair the cracks in the system so the next time this kind of hell is unleashed, whatever form it takes, we're going to have systems in place so we can do far more.
Absolutely. So look, we have 10 more minutes, so I'm gonna lump two questions together, and I'll let you round it off, because I just noticed actually that there's a chat function to this whole thing, and I saw a message from Zahid, and he says, will there not be a social component to manage the fear that people will have when they're told that they can begin to resume their lives? A recent poll showed that 72% of Americans will not attend a sporting event until there's a vaccine. That could be 12 to 18 months. And then Muhammad Melas said, even if there is a vaccine, the virus is mutating and one will probably never be really safe. Ultimately, we will all be exposed to getting the virus probably again and again under a different strain. This is literally, guys, the conversation that I was having right before I came here to do this chat with a friend of mine on talking about the future. And Dr. Fauci, he was saying that one of the lessons that should be learned from this is that we should never shake hands again. Why are we shaking hands anyway? I mean, so there are all of these different conversations that are already starting to begin about, well, what even happens now? And so the one question that I have about that, that I'll throw at you is, no easy question, sorry. Is if we're talking about government response and preparedness, okay, if the government has not done a good job so far in responding to what has happened so far, and what we've learned is that governments have to be more proactive in responding, not in being proactive, not just reactive. Is there a role for governments to play in setting the tone or the stage or preparing societies for what is to come? So that's my first question. And then the second, and maybe just kind of related, because we haven't really talked much about the role of international organizations in this crisis. I mean, we've talked about governments, but what about organizations like the WHO, who's come under intense criticism for being too close to China or being too close to different governments, the UN? Is there a role for, should we just kind of accept that there will always be a limit to international organizations and their efficacy because they are only as good as their parts, and their parts are actually different governments who are at odds with each other? So where should that international organization component fit into everything? So I'll just leave you with those two questions, and you have about 10 minutes. I think we have 10 minutes till we're done.
So I want to thank Zahid for that question, because I think it's a really, really important one. And the social component has not been deeply discussed in public, where it's happening in small little places. But I actually think, when I think about the response that we need to set into place right now, it needs to be an international task force on all of these elements. One is the component of containment of the virus and making sure it's not spread and what we can be doing. But the other is how the world actually works and what we can be thinking about. And that dimension is the dimension that would normally include DFID, USAID, WHO, the UN, some of the other real Mercy Corps. I mean, like, we can list a bunch of really awesome development and humanitarian organizations that actually have done this kind of work in a different way, but connectedly, that can offer best practices. We do not have to start from scratch. There are things that we need to do, but here's the big word. The big word is scale. This isn't about, just getting to the end of the year and being able to do this. It's understanding that the implications for the children that are going through this today will be deep. They will be severe. They are going to be scared. They are going to, there's like a wave after wave after wave of things that we're going to see because of what has happened with self-isolation, for the way people think about human to human, to the way we're now interfacing with technology in different ways. And I think I'd love to see the kind of deep thinking that goes into this by both child and adolescent experts, but also technologists and futurologists who can actually look at this and think through the things that we need to have in place. I don't know whether or not we're going to ever hold hands or shake hands in a grip, or we'll do like something that's like distant, or what we're going to do. That's not the point. The point is how you feel about being in society, how you feel about trust. That's the issue that I would really say is at the center of everything. Who do you trust? What do you trust? What's important here? And so for me, this isn't just the role of the government that needs to build the global task force. That's one part of it, and they need to get with the program and do it. But the second part of it is this sort of more open power element of how we think about different aspects of society and experts to help us think through some of the social problems that we're going to be dealing with and what we can get into place in the meantime. And the final point is money. Okay, and this is like, an obvious, but if we're not prepared to get this right, it won't be right. And I'm afraid to say that I have yet to see in the United States and in many parts of Europe, people willing, once the crisis passes, to do what needs to be done, because they think it's all done. And the only reason I know that is because I look at what we've been talking about for decades around the environment. For decades and decades and decades, climate change, climate change, climate change. People don't take it seriously, and now we're in the kind of crisis that's the next big thing that we're going to be dealing with. And if we had put the money in early, if we had put the focus in early, if we had put the system change early, nobody, the conversation we had 15 years ago was that you're not going to get an American to recycle. Are you kidding? They're not going to separate their trash, but behavior change happens. It's a herd thing. One community starts doing it, then the next one, and you're starting to see that kind of change. So to go to the heart of the answer here, it's going to be a multi-sectoral commitment to making sure that we are rebooting all of society to be able to do this. Direction must come from government for sure, but that cannot be the only place that we see change.
Yeah, of course. And just as you were saying that part about funding, we had another comment from Mohannad Melas, and he said, if the US keeps cutting the funding to WHO, USAID, and others, they really will not have a chance to do the work the US government needs to fund. So again, it's these international organizations, their pot of money comes from distinct and separate governments, and so every one of those governments has to do their part. And I just to sum up, because you've brought up so many important points in this discussion, and if there's just a couple of points that I really came out of this with, it's just that it's not just leadership that counts, but it's leadership from different sectors of society, that we have to look at non-traditional ways of leading and being together through a crisis, that a society is the sum of its parts, and that everybody has to do their part, from the top, from the president to the very individual, that there has to be some empathy for what other people are going through, and that some people don't have it as good as we do. So to remember that as well. And to not throw out everything that has been done by previous administrations just because you want to have your own mark on things, that there is something to be said for continuity. And then finally, just trust, how important trust is, not just trust between the government and its citizens, but trust between the citizens themselves, and how important that is, and it's the glue that kind of keeps everything together. So I'll leave you with the last word. I think we have maybe 1 minute left.
Yeah, no, so in my last minute, I want to thank you for doing a wonderful job in this last hour. I also want to thank Zahid and Mudassar for inviting me to be part of this special conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I'm inspired by I'm inspired by many of the people in this network who have taken on other issues with diligence and focus. And I don't know what is planned for the COVID response, but this is on all of us to see the Concordia team do more. I think that there's going to be real social impact with all of us, because we are having these conversations, and these real conversations. And I'm honored to be part of it, and I want to thank you, and please let me know what I can do. But there's one final thing I have to say. I saw two people on here who I haven't seen in years, so I just want to say, Fadim, it's so great to see you. I am so happy to see you. And I see Rufal's name somewhere on there. It went away, but I don't see his picture. But it's great
to see you too.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. I can't even say. So, mwah, thank you very, very much. Take care, everyone. Stay safe and stay healthy, please.
You too.
Bye-bye.
I really just want to thank both of you, Farah and Jasmine. This has been an amazing session. I feel like a 400-page book has been downloaded into my head. It's really incredible. And we really hope you guys come back and join us at some point. We're continuing this every week as long as we're sort of under isolation. But the inspiration, I think, means a lot to us. I think a lot of us are going to be in a position where we can really make change happen after we have the means to do so. So thank you again so much for participating.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Our last hour is upon us, and I'm going to hand over the reins to